stuff with radio waves to see how they react. This is the sort of picture I look at when I am seeing biological substances. That is a graph of the dielectric permittivity of biological materials. The dielectric permittivity is what describes how a material changes the character of an electromagnetic wave. Basically, how is it going to absorb? How is it going to reflect waves? And these represent the absorptions of energies. And it's pretty boring, but basically you've got tissues down here and you've got all the way up in the high gigahertz to the reactions of bulk water. Says a lot to me, but not to many else. So, having said that, we've already heard more than enough evidence that there seems to be non-thermal effects, and I can put out more and more articles up here. But at the end of the day, we're seeing some pretty strange things. Well, so let's talk a little bit about dosimetry. What is the SAR? You've heard this term already for the last 2 days, the specific absorption rate. What does it actually mean? I really can't speak standing still. So I'll use this one instead. Well, basically, the SAR, it measures how much electromagnetic energy you can stick into something, and that's represented by this, and that's the field strength, over the density of that thing. And then you can translate that, the amount of energy absorbed by that mass, you can translate that into a change of temperature. So here on the other side, we've got delta big T, which is the change of temperature according to time, that's the delta little t, and that's the specific heat, which is another physical concept which tells you just basically how much that matter can absorb heat. Sometimes you'll see it talked about in terms of power density. This is the other big unit used in dosimetry of electromagnetic radiation. But we're going to skip past that. So, the standards. The standards tell us that basically we don't get very much. It's only really thermal and nothing else. Non-ionizing radiation can't do much. That's what they say. I think we can all agree that that's not true. And how do they actually measure dosimetry for a human being? Well, they take a bath with a roughly human outline in it. They fill it full of a liquid, which is homogeneous totally, which has the average characteristics. You know what? I'll use this one. Which has the average characteristics, electromagnetically speaking, i.e. how it absorbs electromagnetic energy, of human flesh, averaged. And then what they do is they have a field sensor, which is this thing here on a robotic arm, which goes inside and measures at various depths the electric field that it can sense. And your phone is placed underneath. Now, because we are talking of continuous wave, the phone isn't working as it usually works. It's actually working by pushing out a continuous signal all the time, which is not how it really does things. Well, let's just talk about if that bath is valid. Well, the bath isn't valid. This is a lovely piece of work done by Garcia Fernandez in 2010. What you're seeing here is a computer model of the human skull, but this time, instead of looking at it just as a homogenized lump, they take into consideration that skin, tissue, fat, brain, blood, capillaries have different electromagnetic properties. They absorb in different ways. And if you look at the number of different parameters they have to put in to make this, you can see it's quite different. You've got blood vessels, bone, and here you've got the dielectric permittivity, how it will react to an electric field. Next to it, you've got its conductivity. Does it conduct electricity at all? Then further down, this will be its density. Then it's got its specific heat, etc., etc., etc. We'll go down. And they run electromagnetic simulation models in computers. And what do they see? This is for 1.8 gigahertz, basically cell phone radiation frequencies. And you can see here, that's the specific absorption rate in reality. Now, the way that the industry measures it using that lovely model, you would actually just see a slight curve that will go down like this because it's homogeneous. As you can see, it's most definitely not homogeneous. And different areas, actually, you're going from the skin out here. This is skull. This will be just under the skull over here, and then into brain tissue. This will be the sac and heavy water over there. And this will be the temperature change, because they can do that. It's very simple to do. Is that mine? Just, say no. Okay. So this is just showing that that idea of a bath is ridiculous. It's not going to give you any real sense of what's going on in the human body. However, industry, and this is taken from the industry site, Mobile Manufacturers Forum, loves to show just how fantastically safe they really are, that everything is not going to be bad because it can't heat you up. This would be high for heating and you're down there somewhere. What can I say? So, it's not realistic. Does the industry keep to it? Will it keep to it for 5G? No. And why do I say that? Well, before I go on there, we have to move away from this ridiculous method of, gauging SARs to full simulations. And these are actually computer models of the human being. This is from the ITIS Foundation in Switzerland, and they produce this. This is actually commercial, although it will cost you an awful lot. And they have different models of different types to basically cover all of the human population. I particularly like the names. Thelonious, he looks interesting. Roberta Dizzy, I'm not quite sure why they call him Dizzy, but Fats, I think we can probably guess why. But anyway, these are interesting models because these models include not just skin, tissue, fat, muscle. They also include blood capillaries, flow. When they look at the way that heat is generated, they take in consideration heat perfusion, the cooling effect of the blood. They can link between the input of energy to the output of heat. They're already 2 or 3 steps above what we have now for gauging SARs. Okay, but are we actually evaluating exposure correctly? That's the other big question. Because once again, the SAR's not relevant. We've seen that. That's pretty clear. But when we look at what we're actually doing, why is it not working? There we go. These simulations, and this is another simulation study done by a Japanese group, these simulations are still basically taking a continuous wave and pulsing it in and seeing what happens. But our phones aren't working on continuous wave. And once again, the resolutions that we have on these models is only down to about 1 millimeter. For your information, your skin in its thickest part is only about 0.5 millimeter. Okay, up here it's only maybe about 0.2 of a millimeter. Soles of your feet, it may actually be about 3 millimeter. So there you go. So when it comes down to the smaller vessels, the smaller dimensions, they're not really relevant. And this is important because as you go to higher frequencies, and 5G eventually will get to that 20 gig, the wavelength begins to be of the same sort of dimension as the entities we're looking at, as things like skin. And in that case, we have to take into consideration some fundamentally different modalities of interaction with the tissue. It's not just simply absorption. We get things like standing waves. So, to give you an idea, let's go forward. And this is the other point. Now, this is taken from this article. This article was done by Ezra Neufeld. It's a theoretical piece. And his question was quite simple. He said, okay, we have SAR. That's great. But it's based on a continuous wave. What happens if I send in pulses? And he did the theoretical work to take pulses, working on a frequency of 5G, that's 5 gigahertz rather, put them into the body, okay, with the equations that he knows about, and to see would it cause any measurable temperature effects. And what he finds is most definitely it would. In fact, you could probably cause a temperature rise of 1 degree in the skin because of the pulse nature, okay? That's theoretical. And that speaks to me because as a theorist, as a physicist, that a lot of what I do when I investigate materials is exactly that. I put in a pulse and I see what comes back. but you want to test it. So relating this to the model that you heard from Yuri Feldman yesterday, okay? That's actual real images of human skin. And it's done with a methodology called optical coherence tomography, which allows us to image the water content of the skin. And what you see here is the surface up here. That is your dermal layer, the dermis. This is the epidermis, and those coils are the sweat ducts. And they are really that, they look that regular, they are coiled. Now, the dimensions are very important here because this epidermal layer can be 0.35 of a millimeter thick. Okay? Now, in terms of the wavelength of impinging radiation, that already brings you down to the high gigahertz, but it's already significant enough that the modality of interaction is going to change. It's not going to be simple absorption. It's going to be standing wave absorption. And what that means, if you've ever been on the beach in Tel Aviv and you see the waves coming in and they go through the barrier and it looks fine, and all of a sudden a wave whacks you from the back because it's been reflected by something behind you and two waves have come together and you get a bigger wave. And that's exactly the same thing that will happen with electromagnetic waves if you've got two surfaces that can reflect, and you do. That's not to talk about the fact that this spiral is just like an antenna, and at the right frequencies, it will work like an antenna. In fact, we showed this in a paper. We built the model. This is the model that we built of human skin now. Now, the resolutions here are down to microns. Okay, so we can't do big models. We can't do whole bodies, but we can do something at least looking at the levels of the skin. So we've got micron resolutions. The whole of this model is only about 0.5 millimeter thick. Okay, and that's about 0.2 millimeters up on the top there. But it allows us now to put in frequencies far higher, and you can see the work we did here. This actually went from about 50 gigahertz all the way up to about 700 gigahertz. And to see the absorption on the level of this, to see this work like an antenna, okay, which you heard Yuri talk about yesterday. So this is actually a SAR model. We're looking at self-absorption rates now, but these self-absorption rates are not happening because it's just simply absorbing. They're happening because this is acting like an antenna, and it can preferentially absorb at specific frequencies. So we see if we go to very high frequencies, 400, we see grace changes. Now this black line here is interesting because that's when we remove this totally. And so you just have the layer models. So the layer models won't do too much. You'll see a slight bump over here when you get to very high frequencies. Yeah? But once you have this inside and it works like an antenna, then yes, you begin to see some heightened absorption that shouldn't be there, but is there and will be there. And this is a little worrying because 5G is just over here. 20 gig is about there. We're not too far off. But that's still on a continuous wave. Continuous wave means I'm just putting in a train at one frequency all the time, never stopping. What happens if you stick in a pulse? Now, this is the work that Noah Betzalel has just done, and she allowed me to show it to you because it really is significant. Now, what we've done this time, we've taken that model that you see here, okay, and we've now put in a pulse. The pulse is very narrow. It's only about 0.2 nanoseconds. That's only because of computer time and the difficulties of doing this. But the conclusions are the same if it was a longer pulse, specifically of what we'd expect in the nanosecond regions, which we're going to get in 5G. So this is basically the dimensions of what we put inside there. And we stick that inside, and because I am a physicist, and I cannot feel that this is a lecture without an equation, I've stuck in an equation. The reason I've stuck in this equation, because what it's telling you is that if you want to describe any electric field, its strength, yeah, in time, you can break it down to a whole bunch of frequency components at different amplitudes. Sum them all together, and that will give you that. And that's basically what I'm showing there. K, by the way, is the reciprocal wavelength. So the important points about this are, well, the highest frequency or the lowest frequency you're going to get on these elements is going to be defined by the width of that pulse. Okay, that will give you the lowest frequency. Now, the rise time to get up there, yeah, this slope, will actually give you the highest frequency. Okay, so between those two, all these components will be, and they'll be at various different layers. So what do we actually see? That's the important thing. So here is our simulation. This actually runs. Now, you're not seeing something in time. You're seeing something at the moment, which says, just look at what happens at 450 gigahertz. What we see here, we see the wave coming in. We see its frequency component, strong absorption at the very top of this duct, and it sort of peters out. But there's a lump at the very bottom. But this is the boundary between the dermis and the epidermis down here. Now, this is full of sensors, by the way. Okay, so energy is being pushed in at one particular component. But then you'd say, okay, that's great, so what? This is the actually important thing, because this red is actually very low. It's about 5 times 10 to the minus 12. We're working in picowatts here. This is really low stuff. But that's not important. Let's see what happens when we go and look at the component at 20 gig. So if we go to the component at 20 gig, here we go, and we run that. Now initially you'll say, wow, it must be less because the colors aren't so dark. However, the scale's changed. It's 1,000 times higher. And it's going all the way down into the low, all the way down, lower dermis and into the fat layer. So this is a point. The industry will tell you that according to SAR, 20 gig will be absorbed into the skin layer totally, and that's it. It's not going to go any deeper, no problem, stop worrying, buy 5G phones. Because of the nature of how we transmit data, which is basically a pulse signal, and now a pulse signal, the fact is we will excite many different frequency components, and those can go far, far deeper. Okay, now we used a very low pulse here, but the statement by industry that it's in the skin, no more, is false. Okay, quite simply false. So it confirms this work. How much more have I got? 5 minutes. I haven't even got to the interesting part. I shall run. We've confirmed Neufield's work, number one. That's the first point. That this paper is actually true, correct, and yes, there will be significant effects. Let's put it there. I've just told you that, and so I'm going to skip that because, and to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it is the envelope, stupid. It's not the frequency, it's the envelope. Okay, so, and of course I'm not referring to people in the audience here, everyone else. Well, so how can you gauge what the real exposures are presently? Now, Stellian gave us a lovely talk yesterday, and he's right. They are monitoring the output of cell phone antennas almost continually. But that's great, but we're not standing on the cell phone antenna, so it doesn't really tell us too much about what we are feeling ourselves. To do that, you need a meter with you walking around all the time. And Amir after me will tell you just how difficult it is to find a meter that can give you the real picture. He'll go into those particular problems. But there is one meter that we have all the time with us, which actually does the job properly, and that's the cell phone. Because it needs to know how much it's getting to tell itself how much to put out to get round. So we can actually use the cell phone to do this. Now, a couple of companies caught onto the idea, and they did the work to make applications which work on Android, which can actually expose this data, which is in every cell phone, for the user themselves. One of them is Cellraid, and we're using this one, the Quantum Monitor, or the Quantum Pro, which is better, and it gives you a value, and of course it puts it into the language of industry, so it talks about SAR, okay, but their new versions of software actually show you the full frequency spectrum as well. But it can show you when you've got up to about 1 watt per square meter, which is considered not a safe level, but still acceptable. Okay, so here's some examples. This is Australia. That's 3 watts per square meter. That guy is probably driving in his car, and so he's being quite exposed there. And this is being plotted all the time, also with geographical position, so you can, get the real idea of what you're really experiencing. The software can also name the particular cell that you're in contact with, so you know where the tower is, so you can get an idea of how it changes with distance. And I have to say, there's one important thing. It does depend, of course, on the provider. And if we look at Japan, middle of Tokyo, not so bad, of course, because there's many more cell phone towers around you. And I have to stress, while cell phone tower radiation is a problem, it's the cell phone is the big one. It's with you all the time and it's on. Even when you think it's not, it's on and it's pulsing. But less overall exposure, of course, because, hey, plenty around you. Small cells versus macro cells. Yes, it's true. The small cell will give you less overall exposure. because it's basically your phone that's the real problem here, but it doesn't say what's going on around you. Macro cells are worse. LTE, UMTS, and of course, it really does depend on who, this is from Honduras, who your provider is. That will also change. Two cell phone providers, you can see one, he's working on UTMS, this is also working on UTMS, but very different exposure levels for the same basic phone. By the way, the model is also important, but we're not going to get into that. So what about us? Here we are. This is I gave one of my students. I made him drive from Ariel where I'm sitting with his car, and you can see the exposure levels. The red is high, very high, that's hot spot. Yellow is very nice. As we get close to built-up areas, of course, there's many more towers. His personal exposure level goes down, or at least what the phone feels goes down. Let's put it that way. Okay, and we're inferring that the phone is with him. By the way, as an aside, he was shocked to discover that all this area, he was actually talking through the Palestinian phone system, which was a bit of a blow to him. So, yeah. Where I live, Modi'in, yeah, you can see I'm routinely exposed if I'm driving around to 3.6 watts per square meter, which I think is rather high. That's because Modi'in doesn't want to have cell phone towers or small cells, and it only has peripheral towers around the outskirts. So at any one point, a person is at least a kilometer away from a tower. And there I can get the breakdown, and this is important. Now, the breakdown is very nice because, of course, it gives us the total emissions over all what you're feeding. That includes what you're getting and what you're putting out from the phone, okay? It can break those down into the network, what it's receiving in total, and it can break those down into the mobile, what the mobile puts out. And as you can see, these are histograms of that entire journey. The network levels are always very, very low. But the downside is network levels that are low means cell phone levels that are high. And this is still the main component. So you don't get any great advantage if the cell phone towers are far, far away from you. Yeah, you yourself from the cell phone tower won't be much, but if you're walking around with your phone and screen times today can be up to 9 hours, you're basically cooking yourself anyway, so it doesn't help. You actually do need antennas, but you need different types of antennas than what we've got. 1 minute. You're going to be generous, because I was generous to you. Thank you. I have host privileges. Okay, so if we actually break down these into further, we can actually look at the transmission of the cell phone. That cell phone means conversation, talk, in this case. Transmission of Wi-Fi, because of course we're getting Wi-Fi as well. We can see that the real baddie is actually, this is in terms of field, the field strength now. The baddie is actually 100. It's the transmission of Wi-Fi from the cell phone, much more than the reception and the reception of Wi-Fi. They're actually lower. If you look at the transmission of Wi-Fi here, it's about 40, and this is about 100. This is in decibel volts per meter. So it's the cell phone all the time, and it's actually the Wi-Fi is more damaging. That's what we're really pulsing out, much more than conversations. Okay, so here's the Shom 1, driving to work from Modi'in, routinely 3, 4, and that depends, of course, on the model of phone I'm using. If I'm using a different phone, it may be less, it may be more. Okay, and by the way, if you remember the talks of yesterday, many people have the phone on them, and then the levels of SAR, and this is actually directly proportional to the level of SAR, the level of SAR jumps fourfold. So in this particular case, I'm routinely going over the accepted safety levels in Israel of SAR. So, and there's the breakdown of all that. I'm running a little bit here so that Daniel won't get too angry with me. And so now, because we have cell phones and they are meters, you can build software now. So I've built a software here whereby I can take many of these routes, this is Modi'in itself, and start analyzing data continually over all different places. I can build up maps of exposure levels all around. I can sort of begin to gauge also behaviors. I can also see the differences between different cell phones. And if I look at some of the information I get, histograms, these are the morning school run. Okay? These are the nighttime picking up teenager run. And of course, what you see immediately, the amounts of, there's the transmission of Wi-Fi, much higher. You can see the totals are much higher, 4, whereas compared at night, I'm actually coming down in terms of totals less not always much less, but less all the time. And you can see the breakup changes as well. So time of day is very important. The number of people actually using the network is very important. It comes to that as well. It changes radically. So what are we doing with all this? Well, myself and Yael, we have about 30, 40 licenses, and we have used them with volunteers who have been just traveling around Jerusalem and all sorts of places. This is for CellRate, yes, using the CellRate application. And what we get is lots of data, which is taking us an awful long time to analyze, but we're getting, if you like, maps of actual true exposure, what the person is most likely going to suffer. And this is, of course, once again, dependent on his cell phone model, and we see the differences between model. Dependent on the provider, we see the differences between provider. And of course, we're assuming that the cell phone is with him all the time. This is absolutely true. Another point which I think is important to say, a lot of the data you saw me do here was outside. Most of us are inside, and most of our cell phone conversations and cell phone use is inside. Which means the exposure levels, or rather the levels of the phone and how it's working, are going to be far higher. They'll reach the peak maximums almost all the time, because a fair amount is actually absorbed by the walls and everything. So the point that Stellian brought out yesterday, the idea of having femtocells inside, is not so silly. It really has a very, very definite point here, because what can you do? Most of the exposure is from the phone itself, and if you're inside, it has to work harder to get outside, and that's the case. So I'm actually not going to put any conclusion, because I think the conclusion's pretty clear. I'm leaving this slide here. The study's in progress. We hope to copy the study, by the way, in Portugal and probably in the States. We're looking for sponsors to do that. Well, the publication will be soon. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Sure, if anyone has.
Niall.
It's actually more a quick comment than...
You have to turn the mic on.
more a quick comment than a question. We've been focusing the last 2 days and in this talk about the adverse health effects and the downsides. But I think there is like a potential upside with the increase in EMFs, that if you keep it in your pocket, you get a non-invasive vasectomy, which is interesting. There's a startup among us that, time permitting, maybe in 30 seconds or a minute, they can share what they're doing, because what you just said in the last minute was a perfect הרמה להנחתה for what they do. Possible? No? You're...
That's fine.
Okay, so perhaps in a few months when the product is out.
Yeah, sure.
Or more.
Turn off the microphone. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.